Sometimes sourdough baking can seem like an insurmountable hill to climb because there's so many new things to learn, but I find that if we understand the basics, then we tend to understand the whole process a lot better. So today we're going to talk about the basics of the chemistry of sourdough baking and why we do the things we do. So let's start with the overview of sourdough baking. Sourdough baking is a fascinating process that involves several chemical reactions. Here's a step-by-step guide on how sourdough baking is accomplished with chemistry. Step 1. Feeding the starter. Sourdough baking starts with a sourdough starter, which is a mixture of flour and water that has been colonized by wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. When you feed the starter with fresh flour and water, you're providing food for the microorganisms present in the starter.
Ooh, hello, thank you for the food.
The yeast and bacteria metabolize the carbohydrates in the flour, producing carbon dioxide, gas, and organic acids as byproducts. This process is known as fermentation. This is why people go for older starters or more well-established starters, because the microorganisms have proven to be robust over that number of years. If we start our own sourdough starter, what happens is we get the wild yeast available from our local area, but it's random because it's just the luck of the draw. That's why people tend to go for the older ones, because that microorganism, that thing that was collected 200, 400, 900 years ago, has proved to be robust, and therefore that's why people buy sourdough starters, especially the older ones, because they have a very robust and proven microorganism. This may sound like a bit of a school presentation, but if we understand the basics, then we can really excel at what we're doing because we know the foundation principles upon what the bread is made. Step 2. Mixing the dough. When you mix a sourdough starter with flour and water to make the dough, you're creating an environment where the yeast and bacteria can thrive. The carbohydrates in the flour serve as food for the microorganisms, while the water provides hydration and helps facilitate chemical reactions. As the yeast and bacteria feed on the carbohydrates, they produce carbon dioxide gas, which causes the dough to rise. Additionally, the bacteria produces organic acids such as lactic acid, which contributes to the tangy flavour of sourdough bread. Number 3. Stretch and folds. Stretch and folds help develop the gluten network, which gives the bread its structure and texture. Gluten is a protein found in wheat flour that forms when water is added and the flour is mixed or kneaded. The gluten traps the carbon dioxide gas produced by the yeast during fermentation, allowing the dough to rise and give the bread its characteristic airy texture. That's why stretch and folds are so important, because it develops that gluten, which then traps the gas of fermentation, giving you a lighter and airier loaf, meaning you've got more air pockets in the loaf. So that's why stretch and folds are so important. And you can watch our video on stretch and folds by clicking the link in the top corner. Fermentation. After mixing and kneading the dough, it's allowed to ferment at room temperature for several hours or overnight. During fermentation, the yeast and bacteria continue to metabolize the carbohydrates in the flour, producing more carbon dioxide gas and organic acids. The carbon dioxide gas causes the dough to rise, while the organic acids contribute to the flavor of the bread. Additionally, enzymes present in the dough break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars, which further feed the microorganisms and contribute to flavor development and, of course, airier loaves. 5. We're getting there now, shaping and proofing. Once the dough is fermented, it's shaped into loaves and allowed to proof, or rise, one final time before baking. During proofing, the dough continues to rise as the yeast produces more carbon dioxide gas. The gluten network developed during the stretch and folds helps support the structure of the dough as it expands. And then we get to the final step, the step you've been waiting for, and step 6 is baking. Finally, the shaped and proofed loaves are baked in a hot oven. As the bread bakes, the heat causes the carbon dioxide gas trapped in the dough by the gluten to expand, creating air pockets and giving the bread its characteristic airy texture. The high temperature also triggers the Maillard reaction, a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that produces browning and adds flavour to the crust of the bread. Overall, sourdough baking can seem a complex and intricate process that relies on a variety of chemical reactions to produce bread with that unique flavour and texture. But by understanding the chemistry behind each step of the process, you can better appreciate the art and science of sourdough baking. To break it down a step further, we feed the starter, which feeds the microorganisms, which then create gas, which is trapped by the gluten we create by stretch and folds, and then we continue to let it rise and let gas expand, and then we bake it, and that allows that gas to expand further, still trapped by the gluten, to create an airy loaf. And that's how we get our sourdough. So either way, now you know the chemical basis of sourdough, we can move on to the step that we know on to next, which is proofing.